Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Ahilan Arulanandam. I'm the faculty co-director at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy here at UCLA School of Law. Welcome to our panel discussion, Immigration Prisons, Hard Questions About Abolition. I hope all of you, 478 registrants and more than 120 and still growing viewers already, are as excited to be here as I am. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at UCLA resides on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. That acknowledgement feels particularly relevant for us, given that so much of immigration law rests on an assumption about the right to exclude people from our nation's territory. Next, I want to thank our interpreters, Romy Malagamba Stefan and Ada Podolsky. Ellos van a traducir este programa en español. Si quiere oír en español, haga clic en el globo en su pantalla y escojan español. I also want to provide special thanks to our visionary communications director, Gabriela Domenzayan, whose imprint and kind of theory of how we should present our information and public education is all over this, this program that you'll hear today. And also our program coordinator, Chloe Lin. She is the brains behind the whole operation. All right, let me begin with some thoughts to frame the discussion that you're going to hear today. As many of you know, I have done litigation and advocacy against the immigration prison system, what the law euphemistically calls a detention system, as though immigration detention centers aren't prisons, even though they are, for basically my whole career, now more than 20 years. For most of that time, I've articulated the case against immigration prison forcefully, but in narrow terms. It goes something like this. Many studies have shown that jailing and deporting immigrants does not reduce crime or make us safer. That's true even when enforcement is focused on immigrants with convictions. This shouldn't surprise us. Right? No one is more dangerous just because of where they were born. So why would we expect the world to be safer if we imprison immigrants after their sentences are over? Or, as is actually true the majority of the time right now, imprison immigrants who have never even been convicted of any crime at all. And it turns out you don't need to imprison people to make them come to court. You can achieve almost total compliance with court orders just by giving them lawyers, or even sending them text reminders before their court hearings, or more controversially, by putting electronic shackles on them with GPS-enabled tracking devices. But making the case that way for years, as I and many others, and those who taught me have done, did not prove to be particularly successful, at least on a macro level. Yes, we have secured freedom from immigration prison and a fair, or at least fairer, day in court for many thousands of people. But almost always, those people were replaced by others. And despite our sustained litigation and advocacy for due process reforms like appointed counsel, bond hearings in front of immigration judges, and our work to improve healthcare in ICE facilities, the population of jailed immigrants just went up and up and up for the whole first 20 years of my career until the pandemic. And conditions in immigration prisons didn't improve much either. In the last few years, and I want to be careful about that because it's not like this is a new idea, but it's one that I think has gained force in the last few years, sentiments within the immigrants' rights movement that favored a somewhat different approach have gained in strength. Advocates at the forefront of the movement for the abolition of immigration prisons stress the demand to end all ICE prisons or detention above all else. On this view, the primary and maybe the exclusive call from advocates should be just to close every single ICE prison, to zero out all the funding for it in the federal budget. And these advocates say we should also abolish all other forms of custodial control over immigrants, including electronic monitoring. At least some of these advocates, not all, but at least some, believe that efforts like the ones that I undertook to advance due process rights are actually counterproductive because they legitimize the system. Now, I don't know that I agree with all or even most of these views, but I think they're very important for people in the movement to discuss. And that's what we do at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, or we try to have hard conversations. And that's what we're going to do today. As with nearly all of our discussions here, we want to begin by grounding ourselves in the lived experience of people who are most directly affected by the system we're talking about. And so we're going to start with a video taken shortly after the release of a man named Omar Estrada Benitez. He was taken into custody by ICE in the fall of 2019 and spent the next 2.5 years imprisoned, charged with being removable for a conviction that was vacated a year before he won his case. He was held at the Imperial Detention Facility. It's a couple hours east of San Diego, California. It's run by a for-profit prison company, which we'll also be hearing about today. He survived not one, but 2 bouts of COVID while in that ICE prison. More than 30,000 people in ICE prisons have gotten COVID since March of 2020. And between his criminal sentence and time at Imperial, he missed out on a lot of 4 years of his young daughter's life. I'm proud to say that my brilliant colleague, Monica Langarica, ably represented Omar and ultimately won his case, preserving his green card. Last month, he was released, and ICE declined to appeal. The video you're about to see, which Omar has allowed us to share with you, was taken by Monica in the moments after his release. Chloe?
All right, what's your full name?
Omar Estrada Benitez.
All right, and what's today's date?
Today's date is March 8th, 2022.
And how long have you been locked up in the government's custody?
I've been locked up since April 2018.
And what happened today?
I got released and I feel super happy, excited. And I mean, a little nervous, you know, but I feel good. I feel super good.
What are you most looking forward to now that you're out?
Spending time with my family, my daughter, getting able to make up all the time that I lost, you know, without being with my family. So just that, and getting my life together, and that's it, just living life.
What was the hardest thing for you about being locked up?
Being away from everybody I like, everybody I love. Just my daughter, you know, not being able to talk to her, not being able to see her. That's it.
Anything else you want to share?
Just so appreciative of everything that, you know, you did, Monica, everybody in ACLU, everybody that helped me out. Super appreciative, and thank you.
Our pleasure. All right.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chloe, and Monica for shooting it. I should add that we wanted to do another slightly longer video with Omar, but he's gotten very sick again, and we wish him a speedy recovery. So now I'd like to ask our first panelist to join us, Alex Rodriguez. Will you please turn on your camera? Hello, my friend.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. So let me introduce you. Alex Rodriguez is a lawful permanent resident who has lived in Los Angeles since before the age of 1. You were brought here by your parents, still lives and works here to this day. And I know you didn't always know this, but his name is legendary because he's been the lead plaintiff in the Rodriguez class action for 15 years, including through 2 trips to the Supreme Court, 6 to the Ninth Circuit. In fact, that case is about to enter settlement discussions. I read the government's mediation statement yesterday. I was talking to them this morning, in fact, making these discussions all the more timely. Alex was the only lead plaintiff when this case started, in part because very few people were brave enough to sue the federal government, and particularly the authorities who ran the San Pedro Detention Center, which I'm sure you still remember well. Alex spent nearly 3.5 years in immigration prison before the government released him in a failed attempt to make the class action go away. And he ultimately won his removal proceedings and remains a lawful permanent resident. So Alex, you have some things in common with Omar, the video that whose video we all just saw. He spent 2.5 years in immigration prison, a little, less than you, but still a very long time. He also had a young daughter, slightly older than yours. Can you take us back to what it felt like to be released? Do you remember that moment when
Um,
you?
yeah, of course I do. Of course, my situation and when my release was slightly different than Omar's. Like I believe he must have walked out of the facility. In my case, I was put onto a van, shackled up, and they didn't tell me. I knew I by that time I believed I knew that I was possibly getting released and stuff, but I didn't know that they were gonna take me to the front steps of my mother's home and slap a bracelet on me for house arrest. So um, yeah, it was. But I mean, at the same time, it was like I didn't know how to act at the moment. So I got here to my mother's home, and it was like a big sign of relief. I mean, even though I was still like under their custody in a sense, because I was under house arrest, but I had a slight thing of freedom. I was able to hug my family and stuff, which I wasn't able to do for those 3.5 years of stuff. And Yeah, but I mean, it was great. After that, it was just getting used to the thing of being on with the ankle bracelet. But like I said, I was just happy that I was able to out. I was able to work stuff like that. But yeah, at the moment I could see it in the guy's face. Omar is like he's just like he's sort of lost the words probably at the moment and stuff. And I mean, yeah, I must have felt the same way and stuff. And Yeah, it just the I'm sure he's still registering it and stuff like that. And But it was a great feeling for myself also. You know what I mean? Although I
To
still had
go,
masters, but I mean it was still.
I mean, to go from prison, but then to house arrest with
Yeah.
the electronic shackle, it
Yes.
wasn't like just like walking out onto the street and you can go do whatever you
No.
want. You still felt like the
Right,
sense.
right. Because I still had a curfew to abide by, and as the time went on, and then I had to report to them twice a month, and they were pretty strict on the things like you can't miss, you can't be late, and I was trying to work, and it was hard to try to at the time I didn't want my employers to know the situation I was in. I felt a little I guess you could say I was like embarrassed of it. Like, like what are they gonna think? Like, oh, I'm just some immigrant now or something that's finding the deportation. I just I didn't want to go through that. So yeah, it was hard to like find the time sometimes to try to get the thing because I was just like ready to start working at that time I was in the dental field, so I was back working as a dental assistant. So working around that stuff and all that, and trying to find time for these people to go and check in twice a month just to see what I'm doing when I'm sure they knew because I had the bracelet on me.
Bracelet already, they knew. Right. Right.
Yeah, you know what I mean. But yeah, I mean, but I just had to adjust to it pretty much, and because at the time I didn't know, but it went on for about another 4 years until,
Right.
as my appeal came back from Ninth Circuit or whatever. So
Yeah, so
um,
we'll get
yeah,
into that, and I want
uh,
to talk about definitely like the fact that to be on that thing for 4 years is it feels not crazy, not as crazy as being in prison for 3.5 years, but also
right.
crazy. So let me bring in our two other guests, but before that, I want to say just that it's great to see you on TV. Seen you in person many times, I've never seen you that, and I
Thanks.
have to say,
Yeah.
I never would have imagined 16 years ago when I met you at San Pedro that we'd be sitting like this on a video camera talking. So thank you very
I
much.
definitely want to, but I'm glad that you're able to still find me, even though when it seemed like I, lost contact or whatever. And yeah, and
It's
still, like
really
I said, I'm always grateful to you, Ilan. I'm always gonna be in debt to you, man. I really appreciate all the hard work you've done for me and stuff like that. So thanks. Yeah.
so let's bring on now our two other guests before we get all too like sappy and happy. So we have two brilliant advocates who've been patiently waiting in the wings. Silky and Andrew, would you both please turn on your cameras? Um, Silky Shah is the executive director of the Detention Watch Network. She has spent almost 20 years doing policy advocacy and organizing to end immigration prisons around the country. I've worked with her on a number of projects, particularly on federal legislative and administrative reforms. It seemed like for a while we would talk every 4 years or something like that. And I've benefited greatly. I've learned so much from you, from your insight and your knowledge. Silky also has won some very big victories recently and has written a lot on abolitionist practice. Thank you very much, Silky, for joining us. And last but not least, Andrew Free is a private human rights attorney based in Atlanta, Georgia. Andrew has played a critical role in a number of important immigrants' rights cases, but perhaps his most important work, and I think the way we originally met, if I remember right, or at least the first time I remember having a detailed conversation with you, involved his work spearheading a set of class action lawsuits challenging the forced labor inside immigration prisons. Those cases have already changed the financial landscape for the private prison companies, like the one running Imperial that we mentioned earlier. And actually, those private prison companies run something like half, right, or more than half maybe, of the immigration prison system. And they have the potential, the lawsuits, I mean, to fundamentally undermine the for-profit private prison model that has defined the growth of immigration prison for more than a decade, I think even more than that. Andrew is also a very compelling writer and thinker on abolition. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us. So Silky, let me start with you next. I think you were the first person I heard clearly articulate, to me at least, the idea that the thing we should be focused on, by far the most important thing, and maybe the only important thing as far as advocacy goals, should just be to close ICE prisons and slash the DHS detention budget. And you have done this work since, I believe, 2000 or 2001. So I'm sure you came to that after a lot of thinking and experience over time. I know you recently had a big win that is arguably vindication for that view. Can you just tell us a little bit, describe your position on that, explain it to us, tell us your thinking and how you got there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ahilan. And I feel so incredibly honored to be with all three of you. So much deep respect for your work and for your struggle. And just really honored to be on this panel. So yeah, I mean, I think, I will say I'm somebody who came to abolition fairly early in that 2000, 2001 era when I was much younger than I am now. In terms of abolition actually becoming more clear to me, I think it was very much in those years under the Obama administration when actually there were so many more people paying attention. That's when I started working at Detention Watch Network in 2009. We started to see that no matter what we did, if we exposed the conditions, if we said, no, this is not okay, or, a lot of people were pushing for alternatives. Obama came in with a pretty strong agenda to say we're going to reform the detention system. We realized actually all the things that we were trying to do and work with ICE on a risk assessment tool on all these different strategies. Actually, what sort of happened under that administration is that the system started working a lot better, which meant more people were detained and deported. And at some point, because we weren't actually seeing the wins, seeing the things that we wanted to see, we started to question what our demand was. And at the time it was detention as a last resort, but it was a confusing demand. Well, who should be detained? Who should be deported? Those were big questions. So in 2012, Detention Watch Network adopted a vision of detention abolition. We don't believe people should be detained for their immigration status. And I think for many people, that position is actually much easier than the sort of larger criminal punishment system that we negotiate, in that people in detention aren't serving a sentence. And, I think in so many ways that the harms of the system, all of that was very clear. In fact, we have a lot of reports, a lot of indication of how harmful that system is. There's no question about that. But the other reason, and I think sometimes people miss this, is the reason that we work on detention abolition and we believe detention shouldn't exist is because it's actually something that really drives deportations. Having the existence of bed space where you have contracts where detention centers need to be filled, where you have guaranteed minimums, which sort of function as local quotas at times, especially pre-pandemic. Those things incentivized local counties to say, or local ICE to say, actually, we need to target more people. We don't have as many people in this detention center. And in fact, we're going to be coming out with a report soon with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center on that specifically, and showing data on that the existence of detention actually increases the potential for apprehension by ICE. And so that it's not
within a local geography, you mean?
Within a
Like
local
if there's
geography.
more detention capacity in San Francisco, there's more ICE enforcement in San Francisco or whatever, right?
Exactly. And I think that sort of gets to this question of like actually reducing the capacity. Say we got rid of Northwest Detention Center, yes, there might be some people who are transferred, but actually there are so many more people who could be caught up in the system that aren't going to be caught up in the system now because you don't have that capacity there. And these are really hard questions. I think abolition is hard for people because closing a detention center means people might be transferred, but the systems are really harmful, and bringing down these systems is going to cause some harm, including potentially people losing their jobs, including potentially people being transferred. And those are things we have to reckon with, but it's sort of a short-term versus long-term game, I think. And we need these are hard questions. We should continue having them. I think though the budget piece is really particularly important. I'll just mention that quickly on why defund. I think the combination of defund and shutdown was so critical to getting us where we're at right now, which is in the last year, 11 counties have actually stopped ICE detention through state, local, and federal level campaigns. The president put forth a budget of 25,000 detention beds, which is a 26% decrease from last year's budget, which is the first time in 40 years we've seen an actual decrease at that level. And I think those things they're there because there's been a convergence. More people have said detention is a problem. More people are providing legal services. More people are doing litigation. More people are documenting conditions. More journalists are covering the conditions in detention centers. But actually, the demands were so critical, because when you say that when the demand is, when the whole focus is on conditions, they're just going to try to make conditions better, which is what Obama did. If the whole focus is on, well, let's have an alternative, actually, they're just going to expand and widen the net to a surveillance program. And we can talk about that more. But when you say abolition and say, actually, why are we doing this in the first place? And I think that's why the local shutdown campaigns are so important, because you have the experience of people whose lives have been completely upended, in that you see the impact on the community and you start to build power. And you start to see actually across the country, these were all seated in different places. And I think this is about local strategies, state level strategies that have an impact on the federal. We wouldn't see Biden doing this if California and Washington State and Illinois and other places hadn't said, no, we don't want to do this in our state. And so that demand, so it's about like exposing the conditions and doing what we can to help individuals do all the work we do on litigation, but we have to have the demand, because without the demand, then there's no vision, there's no ability to get to the place of, and it's been the thing that's been most successful. And in the Obama years, we weren't that successful. I think now we are more successful. And yes, we can talk about Trump and the pandemic, but the reality is, without that demand, I'm not sure if we would be seeing a reduction in detention now.
Right, and just two, I want to bring in Andrew, but two things I want to do briefly before that. You say in successful, talking about Biden, the detention capacity number went up for a little while under Biden and then came back down, right, which I am going to guess you attribute to like very recent activism and pressure on this issue. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think actually part of the reason the detention numbers have been down is largely because of state and local advocacy on interior enforcement, saying actually we are going to stop the pipeline as much as we possibly can between localities and ICE that prevents people being funneled into the system. And that's what we're seeing now. Like most of the people who are in detention are border apprehensions. There are still a lot of people in detention who are being transferred from prisons and jails. But so I think it's a combination of interior enforcement being down because actually like local organizing, state level organizing. And then also the Biden administration realizing that actually detention is not necessary. Like we've successfully made the case that they can reduce this thing.
So I want to ask Alex one question before bring Andrew in, because you talked about you talked about the cost, the real human costs to people getting shipped off far away. if there's no detention capacity locally, then they have to get shipped far away. And I just wonder, I realize I've never asked you this question, Alex, even in our preparation stuff. Did you see people who got sent to Arizona or got sent to other places from the LA area?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Definitely, all over, all across the United States. Alabama, there's a detention center in Alabama that I knew a few detainees I went that they said it was like really bad. It was like terrible over there. It was, I think it was, they had this detention center that was in like one of the city jails or something out there, and they said the conditions were really bad. You know, and it was just terrible. And then on top of that, like, since they got transferred out there, whatever case or the procedure was going, like, it was getting postponed because of all the transferring and all that, and you know, the different district courts, and so all around was just was terrible for these people. Fortunately for me, I was never transferred out anywhere. I was able to stay there. I only went to do different places in the beginning, was from Lancaster and then San Pedro, but yeah, I met a lot of people that were transferred all over the place. Santa Ana too, you know, same area, California. But
and I would think the visitation must be a big part of that then, right? Like then their families don't
yeah,
visit.
yeah, everything that you know, all across, you know what I mean? And I think for a lot of people, mainly it was for their cases being you know, put on hold, because now their lawyers are like, you know, everything's getting transferred, and then like, you know, it's funny, like, we wouldn't know about that. We didn't think unless, you know, you're going through it, and like these people would tell me like, yeah, like, you know, they would somehow they were able to get back. I don't know how some came back from Alabama, and yeah, they're just like, their experience was it was terrible, and they're just happy to be back and continue, because it was, and I think it was mainly because of the family and because of their case being like, you know, it's put on
Your
hold
case is
now.
on hold when you have the venue fight going
Yeah,
back.
it's getting transferred back and forth, paperwork or whatnot. So yeah, but I definitely did see it. Yeah.
Thanks. So Andrew, you waited very patiently. As I suggested earlier, you know, I'm sure I know you have thoughts on all these things, on closures, and I want to encourage you know, people to talk back and forth. But first, I want to ask you, and I'm sure many of our now our 202 participants probably don't know that much about it. So take a minute and tell us a little bit about this forced labor litigation that you started, you know, many years ago now. What's the kind of macro theory behind this approach? Yeah, explain it to us.
Well, thanks, Ahilan. And I just wanted to echo Silky's gratitude for being able to share this space with you all. Your work, and Alex, your advocacy has inspired me and my clients for a really long time. So it's really an honor to be able to share space with you and think about these questions together. And I also would be remiss if I didn't just interject a minor clarification that, you know, while I have certainly been doing a lot of coordinating on the issue of labor litigation in DHS cages, this is a huge effort. At one point, I had to add it up, and you know, there's over 180 lawyers, legal workers, organizers, community members who've been directly involved in some of the 13 cases that have been filed since 2012. And beginning with the litigation that challenged forced labor practices in 2014, we're talking about organizations all across the country. I can't purport to speak for any of them. I'm speaking only for myself, and I don't speak on behalf of any classes. I learned that from Ahilan. You're going to say that if you're going to talk about it. But with all those caveats, I'll just talk very briefly about what the cases are about. In some, they're talking about coerced work for unjust pay. We're challenging carceral methods and carceral models whose profits rely on the nearly free labor of unfree people to survive. And you know, we started looking at these expansions of detention contracts and detention centers throughout the Obama administration. And like Silky, like Ahilan, with frustration, maybe a little bit of sort of ironic cynicism, I heard it explained to me by a detention official who was in the Obama administration that the reason to concentrate all of the detained people in private prisons in remote areas is because they'll be held more accountable than the the public sheriffs who you can't fire. And it's quite a condemnation of public sheriffs in those jails that ICE doesn't think that they would be held accountable. But come 2016, we have the Homeland Security Advisory Committee report saying that private ICE jails neither deliver a higher value nor a lower cost, and recommending that they be phased out. However, the committee essentially hung on the question of how to do that, because by 2016, when this report was being agreed upon, ICE had hinged its entire detention and removal system on private prisons. So now, unlike in 2009, when Obama took office, if you've been through the ICE detention system in the last 24, 36 months, there's a 90% chance that you went through a private prison or a prison that's publicly operated, that is depending upon your body being in that cage in order to make the budget or to make a profit. So what do these cases do? They challenge involuntary work that's in violation of federal and state trafficking provisions, and unjust pay that's in violation of state minimum wage and other common law theories. We hypothesize that this ever-expanding detention might slow or even contract if the lure of free labor from captive human beings were removed from the equation, that the business proposition might change. Because we felt like organizing and movement has an opportunity to effectuate change at the democratically elected local level, to out-organize the prison industrial complex. We felt like it's this sort of profit entity, this Wall Street money machine that's flowing in and literally guaranteeing 34,000 beds each year in the federal budget, regardless of what the need was. We also observed for people inside that work and the necessity for work is a critical component of the daily experience of being inside. From the moment you're woken up and given your breakfast, it's generally by a person who's locked up. Your laundry, your access to cleanliness in the facility, the barbershop, the law library, you name it, people inside are doing the work that makes it run. And so very often we wanted to interrogate that. Is that truly voluntary? And is that done for the benefit of the people inside, as ICE and the companies and contractors say it is? Or is it done for some other nefarious reason? The other piece of this is really trying to focus on legal avenues, litigation avenues that allow for truth-telling that will build power, regardless of their legal outcomes. We understand that sometimes the decks are stacked against us, doctrinally, and in terms of the amount of treatment that humans are afforded by courts as humans. That's a product of white settler colonialist legal doctrines, racial capitalism, and the way that those things have been expressed in our immigration law and in the dehumanization of a person anytime you put them inside a cage. So we hope that by using doctrines like the TVPA, like state minimum wage laws, like unjust enrichment, that aren't contingent upon you being in or out of a cage, we could expand power.
This TVPA?
Oh, sorry, that's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is a law of general applicability enacted by Congress after the Supreme Court said that the congressional prohibition on forced labor didn't look enough. It only covered the sort of traditional enslavement that we would conceptualize in the South. So where are we now? At one point in 2020, over half of the guaranteed beds, 48.6% of the guaranteed beds that ICE pays for were subject to a nationwide class certification for violations of forced labor. The federal government's largest ICE detention contractor has been found by a district court in the Central District of California to be plausibly engaged in forced labor. And that same court found that as a matter of law, the GEO group is violating California's Minimum Wage Act. In Tacoma, the state of Washington, a private class of current and formerly detained people successfully sued GEO, and a jury awarded a $17 million verdict to the class that I represent along with co-counsel. Two different courts of appeals, not traditional bastions of immigrants' rights jurisprudence, the 11th and the 5th, have concluded at the urging of the US Department of Justice that just because you wind up in a civil immigration detention center, that does not mean that you can be forced to work. And so that's where the cases stand now. The federal government is aware of these decisions, and yet the system persists.
Thank you so much. I mean, the cases, every time I hear about these, the cases kind of blow my mind a little bit. I want to ask you one other sort of follow-up question to understand, like prisons also, meaning prisons for people convicted of crimes, whatever you call them, regular prisons, the criminal legal system prisons, also couldn't function without the work of the inmates who have to cook all the food, do all the laundry, clean everything, right? But your cases are focused on immigration prisons, and it seems like they have the effect of really pushing hard on the civil criminal mythology here, right? Because so can you just explain a little about that? Why is your theory not applicable in regular, whatever you want to call them, criminal legal prisons? And how have you used that, the false theory that immigration prisons are civil detention and not prison as like the hook to kind of get in this? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, Ahilan, you were one of the first people I ever heard calling ICE detention centers immigrant prisons. And I think the reason that you explained for doing it at the time, back in maybe 2015 or 2016, was that they're functionally indistinguishable. In many cases, the same places that are holding people for the Department of Justice, for the marshals or the Bureau of Prisons, are also holding people who are there for civil violation. And so it's a distinction that courts have concocted. It's a distinction that has been used to strip people inside ICE detention facilities of constitutional rights. I mean, we can go through and list all of the rights that Alex didn't get because he was in civil proceedings as opposed to criminal proceedings. He didn't get a jury. He didn't get right to appointed counsel. He didn't get right to a 48-hour determination by a neutral magistrate. He didn't get right to a speedy trial. He didn't get a right against cruel and unusual punishment for
bond hearing,
indefinite detention, an individualized determination of dangerousness and flight risk. We can go on. These are not, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But all of that comes from a set of doctrines that Walter Echo Huck calls the incidents or the vestiges of colonialism, white settler colonialism. And it's our project, if we're going to try and undo these injustices, to interrogate those things in the light of history. And if we look at the history here, the history is very clear that abolition in the traditional sense, in the sense that we've seen historically, has fought and won a demand that human beings cannot be enslaved, except for this one, very specialized scenario, which is when you've been convicted of a crime. That does not apply to people in civil immigration custody. So if you're going to take away all these other protections from them, you don't also get to take away the protection that civil status gives, which is that you can't be forced to work.
Very, very powerful and interesting. Now, I want to come back to Alex because I remember a long time ago, I can't remember when, but it was like some conversation we had shortly after you got out. I think it was before I lost contact and had to drive around LA trying to find you. You had told me that you worked. I mean, I knew that you worked even while you were in because of the color.
Right.
And you had a pretty positive view of it, right? Like, can you tell us a little bit about that and just?
For me, I think it sort of helped my you could say like my sanity being in there, because for at least the first year, it was, waiting for court dates. It like took months. Everything was about just waiting in there. It's all it was. So for me, getting a job, I started working in the food service, and it helped me. And even though I would work 7 days a week, and I was probably putting in like more than 60 hours, and getting paid maybe $7 for that week. And I mean, it helped because I was able to get a little fresh air, stay away from all the negativity that might have been in the dorms, all these jailhouse politics, as they say, or whatever and stuff. So it helped me in a sense. The pay, it sucked. I mean, it helped for like getting snacks here and there, maybe buying a phone card here and there. But for me, and then there was times that I didn't just work in the food service. Since I was there quite a long time, a lot of the contracting security guards that were there, they would I guess they might have taken a liking to me, hey, and they would offer me other like night jobs. You want to do it? They had this thing, it was called camp. And that's where you go around the facility, just like mopping floors, taking out trash in some of the offices of the ICE officers and stuff like that. And I would do that too sometimes. So, there's times when I'd go in 5 a.m, and I'd stay both shifts at food service. So I wouldn't come back home till like maybe 8 p.m. And then, come home, I would shower, and then sometimes it'd take me out for a couple hours to do the camp thing. And I only did it because I felt like it kept my mind off of things. Of course, with my case at the time, with the appeal thing, as you know, it just like it was prolonged for such a long time. It's like it was just like a dead stop a lot of times. And
yeah, and Alex's case, I should tell people, if you don't mind interrupting,
Mhm.
he spent for 2 years, his case was stayed at the Ninth Circuit because there was a cert petition in some other case. And I mean, would have been just unbelievably hard, right? There's literally nothing happening in your case for 2 years.
And as you can imagine, I'd always be calling, and my lawyer Alejandro Garcia, and it's like, he'd be like, well, it's still waiting. There's nothing I can tell you. Okay, and I didn't want to feel like I was pressured, but because I just didn't know, you know what I mean? And yeah, so for me, the work thing and all that, I guess it helped me just to keep my mind off of things, you know what I mean, at hand and stuff. So yeah, but I mean, at the same time, like now thinking about it, like wow, like like all that work, and you would think I'd come out and work for peanuts too out here, but
yeah, it's like a lot of cheap work, right?
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's cheap labor, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. But
So
I know a lot of people didn't really like it, and it's understandable. I guess it wasn't for everyone. I don't know, but I only used it to help benefit with myself, and what was going on with me at the time, and like I said, and not knowing, it was like, my lawyer just kept telling me, oh, just 3 more months, or here, we're here, another 3 months, 6 months, and I was just like, man, before I know it, I'm like, I'm up to 3 years, and we're still at the same step. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So let me come back to you, Andrew. I mean, I think Silke, you were saying one of the implications of closure work is you have to wrestle with the fact that there is a human cost. There's also a human benefit. It's a substantial benefit, and but they're both, and that's like part of the struggle, is kind of assessing that, right? Andrew, you must feel the same thing, right? I mean, there are obviously some people who, like Alex is describing. I'm sure you're not the only one, Alex. There's probably a lot of people who work because it's better than being in there without working. I'm sure, at least initially, when this kind of litigation must happen, often the way the system responds is by trying to make it worse on people and be more brutal and more, to try and punish you for trying to have, having gotten something. How do you think about that stuff, Andrew? What are your thoughts on that?
So first, I just want to echo back to Alex that your experience is, in fact, one that we hear. People don't want to be idle, locked up in often a very unsafe communal housing environment, or even in an individual cell for the entire day. And often it's unsafe because the facilities are understaffed. Some of the facilities don't even have a guard in them. We've seen videos of this. And so, one of the questions is, given the options that you were facing, is that a truly voluntary choice? Just because something's pleasurable and you're doing it in custody doesn't make it voluntary. A perfect example is a client of mine at the GINA facility in Louisiana, who fell in love with a guard who worked for GEO. And they ended up getting married. And after he was removed to Mexico, we ended up getting an I-130, or a petition for immediate relative, granted on behalf of the GEO guard, who had to resign in order to be his wife. Just because they might have,
a complicated story.
Yeah, but just because they might have wanted to consummate their relationship inside the facility, and just because it would have been enjoyable, wouldn't have made it lawful. Because of the power dynamic and because of the incentive structure, there's a presumption that sex between guards and people inside is not okay. Just as the same applies in all sorts of other contexts that deal with whether a choice is truly voluntary. But even if it is voluntary, even if you've decided, yes, I want to do that, and that choice is knowing, then the question is, well, what are you compensated for it? And on what basis is that compensation $1 a day? And what the cases have shown, what each judge and each court that's looked at it have found, based on the history of what has happened, is that there's no federal legal authorization to pay people $1 a day. That's why the cases have been allowed to proceed. ICE has simply arrogated to itself the power to set this rate based on an act of Congress in 1979, which stopped having validity in 1980. And for the last 42 years, over $750 million on the low end of labor has been extracted from people in cages without any congressional authorization. So even if it's voluntary, the question is, well, just because you work voluntarily doesn't mean somebody gets to not pay you, right? So those are the two responses to those common experiences.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, in the sort of larger criminal legal system, this is also true. I think there are a few things that people like to focus on, whether it's like prison labor or private prisons, but sometimes are those really the right fights? But I think in this context, it's actually a pretty incredible fight because it's starving the beast. Like, GEO makes money off of the ability to have people who are detained do the work at their facilities. That's how, that's one of the ways that they're making money. And this strategy is both important because it sort of throws a wrench in GEO's plan, but it also is trying to better the lives of people inside who should be getting a living wage while they are detained.
So, Sophie, I want to stick with you, but slightly change the topic. You said in the prison context, some people think of this as not the right fight. I gather that's it sort of turns in part on the distinction which I've seen you write about and Detention Watch Network talk about the difference between, I think, I can't know the exact wording, but it's like reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms or something like that. The kinds of, because it's not like the only thing, or I don't know, one possibility, I suppose, is the only thing anybody could ever advocate for is ending all of it and not talk about any other issues, not talk about lawyers, bond hearings, alternate, all these other things, conditions litigation, slave labor, or forced work, all these things, right? But if that's not the world we want, and there are going to be people who work on other things as well, there's some theory that suggests that maybe there's some of those things which are actually good things because they support the road to eventual abolition, and other ones which are counterproductive because they have the effect of legitimizing the system, like I mentioned at the outset, and therefore kind of slowing that road if we believe that we're going to get there eventually, which is obviously not totally certain. You have, I mean, you've written about this, you have thoughts on this. Can you tell us, and maybe we could do it in the context of alternatives to detention to start with, but I'm interested in this in concept of, or maybe you pick, there's alternatives to detention, there's appointed counsel, there's bond hearings, which is the subject of Alex's, the class action litigation, there's conditions litigation for healthcare, COVID mitigation, vaccines and social distancing and all these things. How do you think about all of those, different things? Are there some that you think are more reformist versus others that are more kind of abolitionist, or what are you thinking on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start with the alternatives because I see that there are a lot of questions about this in the chat, and I feel like I think our movement actually struggles a lot to acknowledge wins. So the immediate response is, what is the horrible thing that the administration or whoever else is doing, even though we just got this win? So in the context of the recent detention wins and the fact that we're starting to see the detention system shrink, I think a lot of advocates were, the immediate response, for very, very good reason, was, well, what are they doing on surveillance? Look, smart link and less invasive surveillance also, like you have the ankle shackles and the sort of GPS monitoring in that way, but then they've also moved towards things like smart link that is tracking, but maybe not like, physically on your body.
That's the phone based. That's the phone
based. And one thing I want to say is that this is literally just what's been happening. There's been net widening. So all they've been doing is saying, well, we are going to grow detention and we're going to grow alternatives or model, like ecarceration, essentially is what I would call it. And I think we have to celebrate when we actually see a reduction in one of them, because it's an important thing. So yes, a reduction in detention is still inherently a good thing. And it's still easier to deport people and do all the other horrible things they do, like in the context of a detention system existing. But we also have to fight against ecarceration. And I think this is a perfect example of why actually having an abolitionist lens and sort of understanding reformist reforms versus abolitionist steps is so critical, because for so many years, advocates, members of Congress, so many people said, well, these folks shouldn't be in detention. Let's put them, let's get them out. They can be on an ankle monitor. We can still track them. But that still presupposes that some detention is necessary because there's essentially an alternative form of detention. And it still is a sort of tracking system to bring people back into the system if they want to. And so I think part of what we're saying is actually we need to be really, really careful about the policy recommendations we make. I mean, I remember years before, and this goes to sort of the access to counsel thing or healthcare or other things that actually, you know, you had advocates actively supporting new detention centers in like near cities. That was the thing that we thought was going to be better for the system. But the truth is, again,
because they'd be closer to lawyers, because
they'd be closer to lawyers, because they'd be closer to hospitals. I think that's also a really critical piece. Like there's so many things there, which is both understandable and also sort of misses the point, because ultimately, do we believe people should be detained? I don't know. I mean, some people might believe that, but we don't believe that. You know, as Detention Watch Network, we don't believe people should be detained. And why should we propose something as a solution that is still sort of in the line, that's still just widening the net? And when you look at, actually, I just wanted to read this, the like critical resistance definition of the prison industrial complex, and I think we should all understand this, is a term they use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And if we understand the sort of deportation machine as this sort of, you know, backlash response to people arriving, to people in this country, like and this as a quote unquote problem, then our question is, you know, to me, incarceration sort of fits within that, right? Like we don't want that. So I think both we have to celebrate the fact that detention is shrinking, and we have to like really be clear that some other form where either somebody is tracked or compelled to engage with ICE is not actually a true alternative in any way. It's not. And I don't even know if the alternative frame is something that's necessary. Like we just don't believe people should be in detention. We don't believe people should be tracked by the US government. Beyond that, I do think there are a lot of different strategies that could exist to like get us closer to less detention and less people in deportation proceedings, less people being deported. And we actually have a chart that we created that I can share with folks. And I think like, it's hard. These aren't easy questions. They're ongoing questions. We're going to continue having them. You know, my thinking has evolved. I think Andrew, other like all of our thinking has evolved over the years. There's no question. I think on conditions litigation, like that's actually a hard one, because at some level, you know, ICE standards aren't codified. So if it's not necessarily, like, I think there's only so much room. So the question, I think a lot of times when you're moving towards any type of reform is this something that's going to further entrench the system? Is this something that's going to build up something that we're then going to have to take down as we get closer to a world with abolition? Or is it something that's going to actually retreat, like help people in the both like the short term and the long term? And so there's a lot of different questions that we ask ourselves. And I don't think everything is like a hard and fast rule. I think there are some things that have become more hard and fast rules, but I think there are some things that sort of fit within that gray area that we need to like continue having those conversations about. And I think on, you know, even recently when they put out this sort of like house arrest model, I mean, I think all of us were very, very terrified of this being out there, but then it goes back to this point of many, many years of advocates and members of Congress, everyone saying we need alternatives, we need something that's not detention. And if we hadn't been saying that, if we've been saying like, no, you don't need anything, people should just be with their families, be with their loved ones, work in community, do whatever they want to do, and go through their immigration proceeding. Without that, could that have been different?
So Alex, are you, well, let me say one thing about this, and then I want to ask Alex a question. You know, for me, this one, both this and counsel, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, and I said your thinking has evolved too, and I want to pick up on that. But you know, for me, this one is particularly difficult because, meaning alternatives to detention, because on the one hand, I'm very familiar with this sociological research going back into the 70s from the criminal law system on the uses of all kinds of supervision And there's just, it's just like a mountain of empirical evidence. I remember Visions of Social Control is a spectacular book by this man, Stanley Cohen, documenting how like time and time again, they present these as alternatives to incarceration of some form, and in the end, the system doesn't actually incarcerate people less, and you have the growth of all these things, and so you end up with more surveillance than you had at the beginning, right? That seems like more state power, more people under state control, right? At the same time, in our litigation, in Alex's case, and a number of individual people I represented, including in individual cases before the class litigation, in your case, Alex, this was critical to getting courts to let people out. And I really had the sense, of course, you never know with total certainty, but I really had the sense that judges did not want to let people go, as you say, as we all, all believe in, at least all of us here believe in, go, just go live your life. But they did believe at some level, the purpose of this should be to make sure the person comes to court. And I don't understand why an electronic shackle can't do that. And so they were willing to go there, even though they weren't willing to go all the way. In this data, we used data on intensive supervision ensuring appearance extensively in the Rodriguez litigation in the Supreme Court, in our ability to pay litigation. The Hernandez case, it's cited in the Ninth Circuit decision on that. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer to your, or any particular, but I really struggle with this because I do think it has played a role in allowing, many people to escape, immigration jail in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. Alex, and I'm sure you have thoughts on that, and I'm sure Andrew has thoughts on that. But Alex, I remember you told me a story that I'm interested in, because you were on one of these we talked about it at the beginning, right? Several years. I remember you told me a story one time about work. How the thing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
So, what are your thoughts as you hear this conversation, and can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So when I was released, they put the ankle bracelet or whatever on me, and probably about a month after I got back into work, and like I said, at the time I was in the dental field, so I was at work, and I must have been there maybe a few weeks or something. And for some reason, that ankle bracelet thing started beeping, and it would beep every like maybe 20-30 seconds, and it was a pretty loud beep. So like sometimes I'd be in there with patients, helping doctors, and you can tell like some of the other coworkers are like, what the hell, what's that noise or what? And I'm just like, oh my God, I felt like red. Like I was just like, oh my God, I got found out. And of course, like I said, my employer, nobody knew that I had that, that was on me or anything. Like I said, I didn't want to like share anything with anybody. Excuse me. And so yeah, like until my supervisor at the time, she pulled me aside. She's like, if you have your phone or whatever, you got to put it away. Is that you with the beeping, or like someone calling? And I was like, yeah. I'm like, sorry, and I went to the restroom, and it's funny, but I was trying to like cover it with something to like muffle the sound, and it just wasn't working. And I'm like, what am I gonna do? I go back outside. I'm working with patients. It's going on. They pull me aside again. Like, well, I thought we told you. I'm like, you know what? I gotta talk to you guys. So I had to tell them like, hey, look, and I showed them, and at first they're like, I could see it in their face. They're probably like, oh my God, this guy's probably some criminal working with us here, and like, what the hell is he doing? Like I could see it in their face already. But when I sat down and I explained a little thoroughly what was it about, immigration and so forth, like I guess they're a little more understanding.
You're fortunate though. I mean, they must have liked you as a worker, and you must have explained it very well, because that's right. Like, yeah,
because it's funny, because at the beginning they were just like, I mean, man, I wish I could have taken a picture of their facial expressions, and they're just like, and I was like, look, it's nothing. It's not like criminal. I'm not like, it's just for immigration. Yeah, and they're trying to, they've been trying to deport me, and like I said, at the time I felt a little embarrassed to be telling my story about that. I don't want people to be judging me on things and all that. And like, as time went on, I just like, you know what, I shouldn't care about that or whatever. But yeah, I'll never forget. I was really embarrassed about that thing at the time, and I don't know why I was beeping. Then I had to go back and have these people switch it out for me. They switched it out and stuff. But yeah, it was like quite a embarrassing experience, to tell you the truth, because it was pretty loud, the beeping on that thing. And I still don't know. I mean, I don't know why I was doing that, but yeah.
Right, and it does make concrete the idea when they say it's like a form of custody that travels with you all over the place. You know, you can not think about it, and then there's a question in the chat about SmartLink particularly, and whether the same issues like what you're describing, Alex. I don't know if that happens with the phone, and I don't know if either of you want to speak to that. And then I want to get Andrew's general thoughts on this before we turn to discussing counsel. But does anyone, do you see that question about how about the consequences of SmartLink and phone monitoring? Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of the SmartLink works really poorly, or like there's been a lot of issues with it. Sometimes there's like facial recognition that doesn't work, or other things that don't always work. So it's kind of, it's been a problem. And then, you know, it might seem like somebody didn't like show up for when they were supposed to show up, but I don't have like a ton of data on that. And yeah, I guess the one thing I would say, Ahilana, to your point earlier, I mean, these are really hard questions, and there's like a scope of conditions of release that we can imagine, right? And obviously the ideal being release on own recognizance parole, or something where people don't have any sort of form of restriction, versus like bond hearings. And this is part of the reason why like saying no bond ever is maybe like sometimes hard to say, because actually that could be a tool to release people, but not exorbitant bond. I don't know. There, you know, those are challenges in our work. But then, you know, as you get to more restrictive models like tracking or ankle monitors, you know, is that the thing? And can we try to be more creative? I understand this is still like ultimately a system that wants to deport people. And I think somebody else had this question in the chat too, which is like, this is the whole point of this is to deport people, and that's what they want to do. And I do think if we're having a conversation about the abolition of immigration prisons, there is this bigger question for us about, well, do we believe some people should be deported? And in that case, that's why the prison exists, right? To do that.
Yeah, so Andrew, any thoughts that you have on the prior discussion on ATDs? And then also the same question that Silky was just trying to address. I wonder if you have thoughts. And this, by the way, Mark Dow is the author of a book called American Gulag. If I had to pick one, I mean, it's like the Bible of explaining the horrors of immigration detention. And this is his question, you know, in the most practical terms, what does abolition of detention actually mean if the underlying laws making people removable remain in place? And in his view, this was a sort of flaw and missed opportunity with the abolish ICE trend and the conversations it sparked. So I'm giving you like 3 questions, Andrew, but what are your thoughts on any of that?
Good. I have 5 answers. So a couple left over from the discussion with Silky and Alex, and then a direct response to Mark. So I'll just own my own, you know, personal piece in this. I think the first appropriations draft that I ever worked on in DC in 2008 was an LIRS measure, a rider that increased ATDs, increased alternatives to detention. And I'll own that. A second is the wisdom of women that we worked with, and some men in the Irwin County Detention Center, who told the organizers and the lawyers who were supporting them that freedom is not liberation. And just because you might be outside the 4 walls of a detention center doesn't mean you're actually free. As we craft systems of geofencing and enclosure and surveillance so that they're ever more present in our lives with our phones, it's not hard to imagine a situation in which the state would want to just preventively surveil everyone, you know, and then if we decide that you are subject to being taken inside a cage, then we will do that with very little notice. The third point is just a practical one, is that we can actually observe that the actors who are running alternatives to detention are the very same actors who are engaged in rampant misconduct and illegality in detention. And it's vertically integrated, such that if you have a BI or the ankle shackle company that Geo bought, Colorado based, if they come in and they say you violated the terms of your release, then you can go into the BI's jail. That's right, a Geo jail. So it's a vertical integration of the economics of it. And then, I think that the experience of getting funding for ATDs was not that people got out of jail. It's that local ICE offices called in people who were already out and put ankle shackles on them because they didn't want to appear that they would, that they were, underusing the program. They wanted to do maximal use of it. Mm-hmm. Why you would send alternatives to detention or ankle shackles to offices away from detention centers, right, is questionable. So those are just some basic understandings. And I think the answer to Mark's question is just a fundamental one about orientation. And I will once again own and acknowledge that my orientation has shifted as I've seen the evidence of how the system responds to the work that we've done, the truths that people have been telling forever about the prison industrial complex, and seeing what happens when you tell those truths. On the one hand, there is the idea that the immigration system is engaged in a fundamentally legitimate enterprise that's supported by American legal doctrine, constitutional doctrine, and tradition, and it's having illegitimate results. So that's Alex's prolonged mandatory detention, that's this surveillance of Black and brown communities, indigenous populations, the dispossession of things and people, separation of families. These are just illegitimate results of a fundamentally legitimate system. And if you think that, then you work at ways to get different results from the system that exists. I think that there's another way of looking at it, one that I've learned as I've tried to understand why the reforms that we advocated haven't been working. And that's that this system is not ahistorical. It does not exist without a past, and it is not operating without an intended future. So the intended future is to enclose populations so movement is contingent upon the consent of the people with the guns, the empire around the globe.
Yeah.
And when that comes to detention, I just think we have to back up a step and ask, what is the basis of the law, the legal legitimacy of the law that the government is using to call someone removable or deportable or dangerous or a flight risk? And over again, when scholars, historians, sociologists, and legal scholars unpack the underlying motivations of the doctrine that leads to what we see, they're simply just white supremacy in very thin varnish. And you don't have to take my word for it. Justice Gorsuch said it yesterday when it came to the insular cases. Yeah. And so I have come to believe that you can be a lawyer.
I'm sorry, I just want to interrupt you for one moment, just to say, he's referring to a case that was decided yesterday on about actually benefits in Puerto Rico, which came out quite badly. It's called United States v. Baello Madero, but in it, Justice Gorsuch makes an argument that the cases that have basically made like second-class constitutional rights for Puerto Rico and other territories, parts of the U.S. empire, are wrong because they're racist and perhaps should be overruled. So just to flag, sorry, I just wanted to say so people knew it's a super interesting read by Madero if you're interested in it. Sorry, Andrew, please go ahead.
No, I think I was sort of getting to that was the wind up. The punchline is essentially that, you either believe that our legal system tolerates systemic white supremacy and racism, or that there are ways in the legal system to deal with it. And even if we're not dealing with it frontally, we can deal with the harm that results. And so that's, I think, the orientation that I use when I'm coming to these questions about ATDs or access to or appointed counsel and other questions about harm mitigation. And I think that, conditions cases which provide another freedom-making mechanism for people inside that is accessible without, the intermediation of ICE, or the discretion of a federal government official, those cases are beneficial because they allow people to liberate themselves. And to define what is that, Mark's question is, how do you define, abolish ICE or decarceration? It means fewer people are in jail today than there were yesterday, and there are fewer jails today than there were yesterday. Mm-hmm. And by that measure, Silky's right. We need to take credit. These are successes. This is moving in the right direction for the most part.
It sounds like on that kind of view, the depopulation aspects of the COVID litigation, you all might favor, but the parts which advocate for better sanitation sort of conditions things you might see differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like there was no scenario where like Freyhut is a bad, no, this is great. Like we want to get people released. We want to do what we can. But I think those questions are there of like, does it legitimize the system or does it, create conditions where people can be released? And I think, Mark's point about like us missing the abolish ICE moment, one thing I want to say about that is I do think he's absolutely right. Like we did. And I think that was in part because the movement wasn't quite there yet. Like, I think there was a lot of lack of vision, a lot of lack of like, what exactly does this mean? And also like, I think as many of us know, like a really horrible immigration system existed prior to ICE. And so it's not just about the agency itself, but about the system that we have that functions to deport or exclude people from coming into the US. And so, I think differently when the uprisings happened in the summer of 2020, there was actually a lot of deep and rich work that had happened around abolition and questions around defunding the police or abolishing prisons that people could turn to and sort of think about, okay, what are our strategies? How do we move forward on this? And I think that's something, in many ways, the immigrant rights movement has not actually been very much a movement for racial justice. It's very much been a movement focused on passing a legalization bill and then has these offshoots that's trying to do other things like anti-enforcement efforts. And now I think a lot of folks really sort of reckoning with what we have to negotiate at the border. But I think, again, like we're kind of behind in that sense. And I think this is us saying, actually, to, Andrew's point, like, this is about white supremacy. This is about like, the political economy that we're negotiating all these different things. And where do we want to stand on this? And I think if we continue to push for these sort of reformist reforms, we could just end up with the system we have. And I think this goes to the council question. Yes, council is absolutely necessary and something that people need. But if we end up with a system where we have federally funded prosecutors, federally funded defenders, when actually we could have a system where we reduce the number of people who are being put into the deportation pipeline, it's like a resources question, it's a money question, it's a power question. And I think those are some hard questions for our movement right now, because due process, it just like, even in the best case scenario, due process, you still have hundreds and thousands of people being deported.
So let's talk about this. And we still do have, we have a little more than 15 minutes left, and it's not as long as you'd need. You need like 2 hours to talk about this properly, but I think it's a really important question. And so I want to get into it. One thing I'll say before that, I personally could not agree more with both of you on the question of the need to talk about immigration policy as a project of white supremacy. It's actually part of why I came to UCLA and left my old job, because I think it's something that we have to find a way to do more. And I think there's opportunities that have been there and we haven't always seen them. I mean, obviously the Trump administration was an opportunity that many people took, and that's, I think, part of why this conversation is happening more now than it used to. Ukraine, and I don't want to get too far afield here, but Ukraine, and just the striking difference between, it's just so, I mean, you can't even read the stuff without seeing so glaringly the difference between Ukraine and how Ukrainians are treated and how Haitians are treated and how Central Americans are treated. My TPS clients for decades, and just it's so crystal clear at this moment. And I do think there's an opportunity there. It's tricky because I favor all the protections for people from Ukraine, and you have to sort of say it in a way which doesn't undermine their humanity and their need for protection. But I do think it's another among many opportunities. But don't talk about that. Let me instead turn to this issue. Alex, this is the issue that we were talking about at the start, but right before we got on the live stream here, which is about counsel. And as I mentioned to all of you, there's on the one hand robust and growing movements for getting more funding for a right to appointed counsel for people in removal proceedings in deportation cases. I spent something like 10 years, and I said, I don't think I'm done either, but spent at least 10 years of many years of my life litigating to try and establish that for people with mental disorders and for children and for other people too. There's now a huge effort being spearheaded by the Vera Institute for Justice. We are providing, in disclosure, I'll say the Center for Immigration Law and Policy is providing technical assistance on some of the proposals on counsel as part of that. And yet also there are, to my mind, at least compelling, I don't know if I totally agree, but very compelling critiques of this. And this is what you were suggesting, Silky, questions about whether this is actually either the best use of the movement's resources or even a good thing at all, and whether it actually is something that we should not be focusing on and thinking about. Andrew, I know you've written about this. I wonder if you can tell us some of that. And then I want to ask Alex, your thoughts on this a little bit from your experience and seeing other people at San Pedro. Andrew, go ahead. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, you're right. I have written about it because a lot of people who I respect very deeply, you included, have been trying so hard to make sure that people who are going to be brought to court get their day in court. And that means, and get a fair day in court, it means you're represented. I think that, my experiences have been tempered by winning tough cases in impossible jurisdictions and feeling at the end of winning, say, a Convention Against Torture case for a man from Mexico, from a judge who has a 98% or 92% denial rate. That doesn't feel good. It feels like I'm legitimizing his 92% denial rate. And watching, at the beginning of the Trump administration, when we watched mass incarceration, expand even further in the Deep South, and as criminal punishment reform in Louisiana, say, decarcerated a lot of the parish jails there, they were immediately swamped with, people detained by ICE. And watching the universal rep programs in some of those places led me to believe that this is not the panacea that we would hope it would be as attorneys. Deportation rates are basically even. And so I don't hold much hope for a system that can create fundamental change if the thing that we're adding to it is more lawyers. I'm deeply concerned about the well-being of those lawyers because, as Lindsay Harris has recently found in her groundbreaking study, asylum work, and particularly detained asylum work, exacts a tremendous toll in secondary traumatic stress and burnout on practitioners. And I think at this point, any large organization that's going to send a lot of lawyers into direct rep settings of asylum seekers without mental health support is basically engaged in black lung style liability, like you're a coal mine owner who sends in the coal miners without masks. We have to be taking into consideration. And I don't see that happening. And more importantly, I just don't think that you can take an illegitimate legal structure and legitimize it with the veneer of due process by adding lawyers to it. The doctrines on which we're adjudicating the right to remain, the right to be with one's family, are antiquated and they're unjust, and they don't stand the test of critical analysis. They dehumanize human beings, regardless of whether you're in a cage or outside of one. And getting better lawyers for that is only going to specialize the body of law even more and convince us that we're doing well. I don't believe in starfishing because I don't think the immigration detention system is an ocean. I think it's been created by people. It could be altered by people. And so we're not just picking starfish off the beach and saying it matters to this one. We're ignoring the people running the wave pool, and churning starfish out on the beach. So those are just some of my thoughts. I put more of them down. But yeah, I'm a hard no on this sort of rep.
Alex, what do you think? I mean, you would have seen, and now you've heard a little bit of this discussion 2 times, right? You would have seen represented people and unrepresented people. Yes. What do you think about all this?
Well, I mean, I think in my time, if it would happen, I would have definitely, taken it. I would have been like, but like I said, if I would have been one of the detainees, especially that didn't have any counsel or money for one, then I would have for sure, definitely taking it. Now, as Andrew's saying, I mean, if it's more of a Irish side on that, I mean, who knows? I mean, if it would do any good, I mean, I would hope so. You know, I would definitely hope so for the people that are in now or who are gonna probably be in the future, because who knows how long this is gonna continue. You know what I mean? Hopefully, it with the help of you guys and everybody else is doing this, like you guys part. I mean, it's great. Yeah, you know what I mean? That, and if it would be, I think it would be okay. I mean, definitely a test drive would be okay. I mean, if you could do it now. My question, I think, would be like, would this be, obviously this wouldn't be like from the government's point of view doing this, because I remember being told like, oh, you know, the government's not going to apply counsel for you when we're trying to deport you. Like, why are we going to try to hire someone to protect you, represent you when we're trying to kick you out of
We're
here?
the ones trying to get rid of you. I mean, so this
Yeah.
actually relates to something that that Silky was that we were talking about again before it started, about the difference between the federal government funding counsel, which is what I have actually always advocated for, and which you're right, Alex, that means the same government that's trying to deport you is also trying to give you a lawyer.
Yeah.
You know, I think that, I mean, that's also true of public defense. Like, you know, I mean, it's slightly different. It's the courts, the courts that give you a lawyer, and it's the prosecution that's trying to jail you. But you know, a lot of critiques of public defense say it's sort of insufficiently radical because it's ultimately all under one government umbrella. You know, some of the programs like the LA Justice Fund, for example, is not the same government. So it's like LA is the one, LA County, LA City, and philanthropy. New York is the same way. You know, they're the ones funding it, whereas it's the federal government. So it's a different government, still governments, but it's a different government. Silky, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, like, one of the stories I was telling Ahilan and Alex before folks got on was about the fact that they added all these federal defenders because of reentry prosecutions going up at the border. And now some of those offices are sort of scrambling to keep the defenders because they don't actually have the same number of prosecutions because of Title 42. And so there is this element, again, when you want to bring the system down, how much do we reinforce it and say, actually, we want to prosecute more people, or we want more people to be deported because we have these lawyers who need to be paid by the federal government to do this. And I think that's ultimately something we have to ask ourselves. I do think, though, in the context of immigration, again, we all know this, like in the criminal context, it's a different thing. And what we've seen is actually more defense in relationship to the rise of mass incarceration. Like those things happen together. And it you know, mass incarceration, I mean, we still incarcerate the most people of anyone in the world, like any country in the world. So that is the reality. We have public defense and we have the system. But I think the other thing to sort of keep in mind is that, like, we actually like the reason why we're winning to some degree too is that, like, people can be released. Like ICE can release people anytime. ICE can do what, like, it has full discretion, and they don't have to target people for deportation. They don't have to do these things. It's actually quite, because of the context in which it is a quote unquote like civil violation, because of these things, we actually can move in a direction where we're not just building up the system to make it quote unquote more fair, even though the laws still exist as they do. And even though there's so many barriers, and even in that context, you have people who would be subject to expedited removal who wouldn't necessarily get a lawyer, and all these other things that are really harmful. So I don't know. I think, again, these like local and state strategies, I think, have been really important for relief and like the sort of mitigating the harm of these systems. But if you have it at the federal level, it just feels like, why are we spending all this money and these resources when we could just advocate to stop these deportations?
Yeah. I mean, I think these are complicated. I share Alex's sense, if I understood you correctly, Alex. Like, who knows where the future will lead? You give people lawyers, you help them now, and you know, maybe this will end the system, maybe it won't. You know, I also have the sense that you know, mass incarceration, it's true, happened alongside the rise of appointed counsel, but we had the massive rise in deportation detention machinery without appointed counsel in the removal system. You know, in fact, timing wise, we won Franco in 2013. NIFAP happened in sometime a little bit before then. That's around the time that Not One More and all these things grew up. So it's not obvious to me that that correlation is the same. But it's tricky. I definitely think it's tricky. And this idea that what both you said and Alex and other people have said also about the idea that it shouldn't be the same funder. I've always thought the federal government was the most important one because they can cover all the geographies, and it's hard to win a local campaign like this in Jena, Louisiana, or something like that. But it's interesting to see that the perverse incentives that are created when we only have I guess 4 minutes left. We've had a request in the chat here, and I know I'm cognizant of the fact that we often have large student audiences and young people audiences here. And so I guess I want to ask each of you, what if you were saying now, if you were talking to yourself then, Silky and Andrew, and for Alex, I would say if you were talking to a young lawyer who was about to go in and represent someone in a similar situated to you in 2006, and for people just joining the movement and all this, like, what would you say? This may be a question about like, how has your thinking evolved? Or maybe just a question of what advice you would give to people just joining this movement or who have been in it for less time than us old fogies. Anyone, or maybe Andrew and Alex and Silky. Maybe should we do it that way?
Well, I think the first thing is just to understand your positionality in the system. By nature, we're coming to it voluntarily. A lot of people aren't. And figuring out who you're going to be accountable to in this work and how you're going to allow success to be defined is really important. Because as a person who's coming to this work voluntarily, it is not for me to dictate the ideal outcome, And I think understanding where you're an ally, where you're co-collaborator, and where is it your place to try and dictate the outcome. And then I think the only other I'm going to send around some advice that I gave to students who are graduating a couple weeks ago, and Ahilan, you can share that. But just in a nutshell, I would say you need to read Courts of the Conqueror by Walter Echo Hawk, because it shows us how we're going to decolonize federal immigration law. You need to read Greg Grandin's The End of Myth, particularly the Border Patrol chapter. You need to read Mark Dow's book. And you need to read Todd Miller's Empire of Borders and Harsha Walia's Border and Rule. There are a lot more. Some of them are behind me because I kind of figured we might have this question, so screenshot it. And but I just think it's comforting to know that we don't have to come up with a lot of the analysis. It's been here by people who've been targeted by this system, these systems, for centuries. And in the ways that they have won, we can draw inspiration, and for the times that are very difficult, we can draw courage and strength from the people who have overcome direct persecution and targeting by these same systems. So ground your work in that, and come back to it, because people are really generously sharing their experiences and their wisdom.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Alex, if you were talking to someone, either a lawyer or an organizer, someone getting into this, what would you tell them? What advice would you give?
I would first of all tell them that I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people, whoever they do, if they do represent or whatever, that are going to be, I'm sure, thankful for the thing. I know I was, what I mean? And I always just thought, like, it's great that there's people that want to like help other people out, like, and sometimes it starts with total strangers. You know what I mean? Just like with you, Alan, like, I mean, you guys came across me and I was just like, what do these people want with me? I was like, what I mean? I mean, it sounded all good. And I was just like, great. And then once like started getting the ball rolling, I was like, wow, this is pretty nice, man. That there's actually people out there that really helping, us, like people in my situation. So, for the people that are studying to do that, I mean, like, thanks, and good for you. And I hope that that you really, obviously, if you're putting all this time and schooling into it, you obviously like it. So, because I don't think you're gonna, it's a lot of schooling. I mean, so I give that to them, and I really hope that you see it, and I'm sure that a lot of people are gonna appreciate you. You know what I mean? Whether it's, I mean, I'm sure the ones where I don't know if it's going to be like for defendant or the other side or what side of the law you may be or whatever. But I know if it's where for people trying to help, you know, especially for immigration. Yeah, and I mean, and I would thank you in advance. You know what I mean?
Thank you very much, Alex.
Mhm.
Thank you. That's it's inspirational, it really is. And Silky, what would you say to people, organizers, attorneys, anyone getting into the movement now, without your 20 years of experience?
I will keep this short because I know we're out of time. You know, there's this quote in Golden Gulag. I will name another book that people should read by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, where she's sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but it's sort of along the lines of like the solutions that we find to prison sometimes because the work we become so professionalized and so connected to funding streams and other things that actually we've effectively become de-skilled at figuring out what matters most. And I really believe that we need to stick to what matters most, like what is to be done, what do we need to do? And I think for people who are coming in or organizers who are excited to get involved, there's probably somebody in your community who's doing this work. So connect with them. And if you want to find them, you know, reach out to Detention Watch Network. We work with groups all across the country who are trying to close down detention centers or change state and federal level policies. To lawyers, I think work with people who aren't just lawyers, interact with people who aren't just lawyers. I think that's so key. And you know, I think the lawyerization of the immigrant rights movement has been a challenge because a lot of times it makes other people feel inadequate or inequipped because these laws and everything is so complicated. So treat people with respect, support them, try to figure out things out and not just disengage because something doesn't fit within sort of the framework that you've been given. And yeah, and I think to Andrew's point, read, there's so much rich work in history out there that we can learn from. But ultimately, I think it's find your people that you can do this work with, because that's what's going to keep you going for the long run.
Listen, thank you all so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I learned a lot from it. And I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be with us. I always hate this part. It's just gonna like suddenly cut off and then we're all gonna be gone. But thank you all. And thanks to everyone for coming to listen. You can follow the Center for Immigration Law and Policy on Twitter. And I think we'll find a way to have some follow-up and publicize some of the information that we've referred to in this conversation in the time to come. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great to see you all. Thank you, Alex. Thank
Nice to see you.
Sophie.
Bye.
Bye.